Good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jason S. I'm a member of the advisory board of the TomTom Foundation. On behalf of our board and team, I want to thank each of you for being here today. This morning's event is part of the final week of programs at the city's Rising Summit titled the Small City Moment. The Small City Moment. This week, we'll focus on ideas and solutions for small and mid-sized cities across America, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's event and this entire week of programs is brought to you by our partners at Apex Clean Energy, whom we want to thank for their incredible support and collaboration. The City's Rising Summit has been made possible as well by the support of community members like you. This is your last chance to donate directly to this initiative, so we'd encourage you to consider doing so today at tomtomfoundation.org/give. Again, that's tomtomfoundation.org/give. Today, we'll hear from Bruce Katz, the director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and whose book and blog, The New Localism, catalogs best practices for sustainable development in contemporary American cities and towns. In his writings, Bruce posits that the responsibility for addressing some of the world's hardest challenges is being pushed down to the cities and metropolitan areas across our country, often without compensating resources or structural authority. As a result, problem solving is increasingly bottom up rather than top down and delivered by networks of institutions and leaders rather than the public sector alone. We are excited to be here today to learn more about his thinking around resiliency and recovery. I would now like to turn things over to our moderator for today, Ross Baird. Ross is an entrepreneur and investor who is best known for finding, developing, and backing people and ideas who are often overlooked and undervalued by mainstream markets. He co-founded Village Capital in 2009 and is the founder and CEO of Blueprint Local Today. Ross, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason, and a huge thanks to the TomTom team. This is such a wonderful gathering. I wish that we were together in person in Charlottesville, but it's been a strange year for all of us. I am extremely excited to introduce my colleague Bruce Katz for this conversation, and I guess to frame it, we have a presidential election coming up next Tuesday, and the last 4 years, what has been going on in our country at the national level has been dysfunctional at best, and probably worse than that in many ways. But there, despite really difficult headlines nationally, there have been really exciting things happening locally. And the great thing about this entire TomTom community is it's full of people like mayors from 50 cities across the country, writers like Jim and Deb Fallows, and policymakers and thinkers like Bruce Katz, who can talk about how to identify and promote some of these wonderful things that are happening locally. So, Bruce, I want to have a conversation with you, folks in the audience. I would love for you to ring in. We're going to have time for Q&A to ask questions of Bruce directly. But I'm gonna just have a free-flowing conversation for the next half hour or so with Bruce. If there are topics you want us to talk about, I'll keep an eye in the chat box and try and weave them into the comments. And then we'll turn it over to Q&A. But I really want Bruce to focus this conversation on what are the future of cities, particularly looking at the last 4 years and before. What is the gap between our national dysfunction and what's inspiring at the local level? And as we look at post-presidential election, as we look at the next phase of what we have going on in the country, what do we really need to identify and build on? And I'll start with a question, but first, Bruce Katz needs no introduction. I assume you're familiar with Bruce's work, and that's why you're here, but I'll do it anyway. Bruce has been a titan of community development, community investment, community wealth building for the last 30 years. He was chief of staff at Housing and Urban Development in the 90s and really shepherded a transition from large public housing developments to much more smaller and flexible and locally controlled communities. And that was a really important transition that I think informed Bruce's future work. He was the director he was a director vice president at the Brookings Institution, led the metropolitan finance program there, where he worked with cities across the country and really across the world on things like innovations districts. How do you invest in both the physical infrastructure of cities and the innovators and the entrepreneurs that are building those cities. More recently, as the director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab, I have been able and been fortunate to work with Bruce. I run a group called Blueprint Local, and we invest in communities across the country. And Bruce and I have been working together on this concept. I'm going to ask you a question on this about really how to build community wealth in American communities. And Bruce has been working on national initiatives and with mayors across the country, really thinking about the next stage of investment in our cities. So, Bruce, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining.
Great to be with you, Ross.
I want to kick it off with a question. I assume that everybody here is closely watching the election results. How did we get here? What I think it's fair to say that what's happening at the national level is dysfunctional at best. Though you may have better words for that. But you've been involved in investing in American cities for the last 30 years. What is broken in our country, and how did we get here?
Well, I do think one of the premises of the new localism, that Jeremy Nowak and I worked on together, was this fundamental structural difference between the federal and state governments on one hand, and cities and metropolitan areas on the other. Cities are not governments. They're networks, public, private, civic, university, labor, community, environmental leaders, just run the gamut. So the federal and state governments can be hijacked by partisanship and driven by ideological polarization, and they are. Cities and metropolitan areas obviously have partisan fights, but they tend to be hyper pragmatic. They're very close to the ground. You can't sort of duck and weave. You got to deal with challenges as they come up. And they think horizontally. They think like systems and act like entrepreneurs. The federal and state governments, basically the way they look today was organized mid-20th century. They're in verticals. They're in silos and stovepipes. You have a department for this and a department for that and a department for something else. At the city and metropolitan level, what you have are challenges that require interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral responses. So I think, this divide between national dysfunction and local energy and activism and positive, action, I think is structural in nature and reflects, what is a radically different century, 21st century versus 20th, where networks basically rule. Well, cities and metros are networks. They're built for this moment.
So maybe let me start with your personal story. I think that when I think of your approach to this, and one of the concepts I want to talk about today is systems, routines, processes, and we'll get into that. But there's a T.S. Eliot line where he says, people run from darkness by attempting to build systems so perfect so that nobody has to be good. We need good systems, but in the absence of good people in the systems, nothing's going to work. And I think you are one of the good people who's been for the last 30 years really trying to do good things. How did you get interested in this work in urban development, future of cities, all the things that you do? What's your story and how did you get here?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and when I was in high school, Lincoln High School near Coney Island, if anyone knows Brooklyn, there was a program at the time where you could take the last 6 months of your high school and go work. And because I think they presumed at that point we weren't really learning anything anyway. So I went to work for the city council in New York City. And that started, just almost seamlessly work in political campaigns, work for the mayor of New York during summers, and ultimately after law school. What I really wanted to do was to, at that time, the national government was seemingly functional. So I wanted to work for the US Senate subcommittee on housing and urban affairs, and that's what I did. And then from there, I was chief of staff at HUD. So from a very early age, I mean, literally high school, I knew I wanted to work on urban development, redevelopment. The issues changed over time. You know, at the national level, at the federal level at the time, if you said urban, they just said housing. So that's what I worked on. But over time, I was able to evolve and iterate into just about every corner of domestic life because cities experience all that. So it wasn't like it was that plan. I was mostly just trying to get out of high school.
So you went to HUD, where you were chief of staff to Secretary Henry Cisneros, and it was the 90s. The Clinton administration was a very big transition in how the federal government thought about investing in communities, and you shepherded a lot of. What did you learn from that, and how has that informed what you've done since that time?
Well, Henry Cisneros was a critical mentor of mine. Really one of the most remarkable public servants we've had in the United States, and really in generations. I would say that Henry, as the former mayor of San Antonio, took the remit of HUD and immediately began to think, about how do we move beyond just the bricks and mortar? How do we think about building community? So as we started working on public housing transformation, the so-called Hope 6 program, which had been authorized and appropriated by the Congress, we began to think about public housing change as a platform for community wealth building. How do we bring in the schools? How do we upgrade the skills of residents? How do we connect these places, which were very disconnected, to the heart of the local economies? How do we build small business? So Henry was in some ways way ahead of his time, because usually if you're appointed to be a cabinet secretary, again, you just go vertical, go deep. I remember one of our first meetings we had was with the Secretary of Transportation, Federico Pena. I mean, HUD at that point was on 7th Street on one side, and the Department of Transportation literally was across the street on the other side. We went over to see Secretary Pena, and it was clear that collaboration between housing and transportation, which for every American is obvious, was an unnatural act at the federal level. But, so I think what I learned from Henry was this notion that cities think like systems. They really cut across. They're horizontal, not vertical. And we were able to, I think, early on start that culture change.
So you and I wrote a piece, which I'll put a link to, that I think really sums up a lot of the critical sea change you see both happening and needing to happen in America today. And the title of the piece, and I'll send a link to the NOAC Labs article of it, is From Community Development to Community Wealth. And this phrase, community wealth, and other phrases like equity, are things that you talk about all the time as things that are both organically happening, but more institutionally need to happen for us to have thriving communities. So what is community wealth? What is happening, and what needs to happen?
Well, I think at the heart of community wealth is a focus on building assets and building incomes, growing incomes for residents of low and moderate income communities, and for the communities as a whole. I think, to a large extent, what happened with many federal programs is there was more of a focus on building the buildings than on really helping the residents of those buildings realize their full potential, and giving them the supports necessary to do so. So to go from community development to community wealth is really about using radically different metrics of success. You know, in the HUD world, when I was chief of staff, the metrics of success is, well, how many buildings did we get built? You know, it was very bricks and mortar focused. In a community wealth world, I mean, you're really focused on radically reducing racial and ethnic disparities on income, health, and wealth, reducing poverty, really helping people and sort of advance with their own individual aspirations. And it is a complete paradigmatic shift in what your end game is. And to achieve it, you have to fundamentally change policy, strategies, tactics, transactions, financial products, ownership, all of it. So I think the community development, you know, world has achieved quite a bit. I mean, again, it was born out of radical urban distress. It's hard sometimes to remember what many of our cities looked like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as US became the poster child for radical sprawl and decentralization. We left many of our cities behind. So community development was a response to that. I think this moment, with the kind of income inequality and racial and ethnic disparities that we're experiencing, we need a different North Star to guide us going forward.
So let me follow up on that. I've joked before that your favorite word is routinization. I don't even know if that is a word, but you
may not be.
You say it all the time. You say it enough and it becomes a word, like Kleenex or something. You know, you've said in the 90s this transition from very very high shortages of affordable housing. We got very, very good at delivering one type of product, which is affordable, low-income rental housing. Today, Housing and Urban Development knows how to lend to that product. Huge community development financial institutions like LISC have billions of dollars invested in these. Banks know how to use the Community Reinvestment Act to finance these. And the supply of affordable, low-income rental housing is much higher than it was 30 years ago, and that, on balance, is a very good thing. But you talk all the time about how that is an asset class today. A low-income housing tax credit deal is a fundable thing. There are other things that are being done in cities and towns all across the country that seem kind of random and one-off. And if they were routinized, we could be able to scale. You use the phrase a lot, scale horizontally. What are other things that you are seeing that are promising? And maybe you can give an example of a project you've seen that are actually not one-offs, really could be implemented in the communities of everybody on this webinar.
Yeah, I would just say that the notion of routines really sort of builds from the notion of cities as networks. Because if you live in a centralized national government world, if we were the UK, for example, right, and everything is driven out of Whitehall and the Prime Minister's office, you know, what you basically need is a law or a policy or a regulation or an administrative guidance. You really think about national. If you live in a city world, you really think about repeating success horizontally. So you look for norms, you look for models, you look for routines, whether they're financial, you know, structural transactions or institutions. So I think we're in a really interesting moment right now, because this pandemic, the pandemics are forcing us to rethink what it means to repair the economic fabric of our communities. So I'll just, you know, a couple things that I think are going to happen in the next couple of years. Number one, as we see small businesses collapse and consumer demand limited because of unemployment and the effects on income, I think we're going to see a buy local movement of major proportions. And that means employers, higher ed institutions, utilities, hospitals, governments need to buy local as a routine. And what that means is we need to come up with just sort of a template for how you collect data on procurement and purchasing of goods and services, how you have transparent reporting and goal setting that begins to look the same way in Charlotte and Charlottesville versus Cincinnati. So, in the past, if you went to most major employers in most cities and you asked, where do you buy your stuff, right? They would say, well, we buy the lowest price and we don't really care where it comes from. And a lot of it is outside. There's a lot of leakage outside of your cities and metropolitan areas. So buy local, I think, will become a routine. Investment in small businesses, in Black-owned businesses, in entrepreneurs, not just through traditional debt from depository institutions, but new kind of equity products. You've written about this so much. Revenue-based investing, shared profit models, given that many of these Black and Latino entrepreneurs don't have friends and family to sort of build their companies from the outset. I think we're going to develop a whole new set of financial products that are based more on equity investments from a broad range of investors than just traditional depository institutional bank loans. So I mean, you just go through every part of what it means to build a city, the demand for products, capital, services. We're in this just upheaval of a moment. The federal government hopefully is going to provide some resources here. I mean, the lack of providing another, recovery or relief act from the Congress the last couple of months is really an act of national malpractice. I mean, they are basically saying to the country, we care more about a Supreme Court justice than about, hundreds of thousands of small businesses, millions of people. I mean, it's just unbelievable when you think about it. But the response to all this is going to be local perfecting a new vision, for inclusive growth and equitable growth, and then these new kinds of norms and models around how do you actually get this stuff done. No federal law is going to tell you how to do this. They may provide some resources that are helpful, but it's going to have to be bottom up to perfect proven success. So I'm mostly focused now, as you are, just to a large extent, on the demand side, procurement, customers that are reliable. Because if you want a Black or brown-owned business to succeed, where's the demand going to come from? I mean, it's got to come from some of these major employers, and then these new kinds of financial products and funds, locally driven, that can then be repeated all over the country.
Yeah, and one of the things that you always encourage the folks on the call to do is try and figure out, if you are trying to do, an entrepreneur support center or an investment fund, or pick your favorite idea for where you're from. Try and figure out what product, what category, what routine it fits in, because what you're doing is probably very similar to what someone else is trying somewhere else. You really coined the phrase last decade, innovation districts, which you noticed a number of different universities, economic development groups trying to do things around how do we transfer technology and create jobs? How do we buy buildings in downtown, St. Louis or downtown Roanoke, Virginia, and get a university presence there? And one of the things that was very effective is using the phrase innovation district, saying, hey, Roanoke, what you are doing is very similar to Cortex in St. Louis, very similar to what these folks did in Copenhagen. That makes grant makers and investors be able to understand it better. That makes politicians be able to understand, they're drawing from best thinking in other places, and it's not just a random person with an idea. So I think, encouraging people to ground these ideas in routines has been important. What has been the impact of opportunity zones on your work and on this conversation?
And so one quick thing about your comment, Ross. First of all, like a good American, I just stole the phrase innovation district from Barcelona. So, but they had it trademarked it. So, but when I was over there in 2011,
like good artists borrow, great artists steal, the old Picasso.
Exactly. But they were talking about this notion of the co-location and the synergistic effect of universities and mature companies and startup and scale ups and incubators, accelerators, investors, et cetera. And I basically felt that they were describing the US. We just didn't have a phrase for it. So I will say that the notion of routines, if you think about how anyone's retirement money is invested by asset managers, whoever those managers happen to be, they are invested in asset classes. It could be multifamily housing in Houston. It could be mixed use development in San Francisco. It could be anything. But that's where this notion of routines come from. The markets function at that hyper level when you have these seasoned analytics. And I think at the urban scale, and this will get us to opportunity zones, we've thought more about routinizing program supports and less about routinizing market investment. So what I found was so interesting about opportunity zones, it was basically saying there should be this potential for people to invest in various kinds of urban projects, right? And they could run the gamut. They could be around energy, they could be around housing, or they could be around mixed use, they could even be around investment in entrepreneurs. But these are equity investments. These are investments looking for a return, because that's how you get the tax deferral or elimination from the federal law. So you and I, from the very beginning, were, I think, really focused on what's the new capital stack. If you have a given affordable housing project, what's the debt side of it? What's the public side of it? It could be the public donates the land or donates the building. And then what's that equity investment coming from a particular investor that has a particular kind of return, a market kind of return? It might be 5%, it might be 10%, it might, it depends on the individual. But I think what we were trying to do is to reimagine the sources of investment for what drives cities, but also what drives community wealth building. And I think opportunity zones, to some extent, were a bit ahead of the current conversation, where we're now talking about radically new financial products for investing in entrepreneurs. And so opportunity zones are not perfect by any stretch. I didn't really come with any reporting, even though Cory Booker, from the original bill was focused on reporting, but it just got sort of knocked out for some procedural reasons. So we don't really have a sense totally about the scale of investment or where the investment is being made. But I think in many cities like Erie or Birmingham, mid-tier cities, smaller cities, they really saw opportunity zones as a way to focus on their priorities. What are the key projects that are going to build community wealth? And let's try to unlock capital locally, market capital, to invest in these things. It was a very different, still is a radically different approach. And I think like the low-income housing tax credit, it took 5 years after the 1986 Tax Reform Act for the low-income housing tax credit to begin to get routinized, so you could syndicate the tax credits, get the kind of equity. I think the opportunity zone market like that needs time to mature, to get seasoned, and then you're going to see more and more capital flow in, whether it's tax advantaged or not.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think you need examples. And these examples both need to be connected to the community and need to be understandable to financiers, policymakers, people who have power in different ways to make this thing happen or not. I'm going to ask a question, but maybe share one example in the middle of it. Gavin has a question saying these things, innovation districts, et cetera, these investments typically go to large cities, but this panel is about smaller and medium-sized cities. How specifically can what you're talking about be applied to a 75,000 or a 300,000 person city? And I might give an example of an opportunity zone investment that we have made. So Bruce, you talked about buy local. One of the things that every city has, whether it's 75,000 or 300,000 people, is a local food scene. It makes cities unique, makes cities exciting. One of the real issues is family farm bankruptcies have gone up 20% in the last 4 years, even though consumers are buying local more and more. So every city has from a culture perspective, an interest, and from an economic perspective, a need to connect local producers, local entrepreneurs, to people who want to consume and buy local, and it could be good. So we made an investment, we blueprint in a mixed-use building in the Manchester neighborhood of Richmond, historically Black neighborhood just south of the river. There's a group called Hatch Kitchen that is a local food entrepreneur incubator. If you want to start a food truck and you have empanadas, you use their commercial kitchen. They have cold storage. You can bottle things. It's basically, if you want to build a food business, it's a food incubator. We, a lot of new developments have in the ground floor, very nice restaurants or whatever. We are going to have, we just announced last week, a food hall with employment opportunities for these small businesses, largely entrepreneurs from the community, to have a start on the ground floor. We are very excited about this project, but as we look at other cities, we've been looking at a similar model in Charlottesville, which Richmond is larger than Charlottesville. Charlottesville is 100,000 people. Greenville, South Carolina, 100,000 people. We've looked at a similar model. You can scale up or scale down, but the idea of a mixed income housing project on what was a parking lot with employment opportunities for local food entrepreneurs could happen in a 50,000 person, could happen in a 300,000 person. How we financed it was people understand how to invest in mixed use real estate projects, which again, you can do that for a smaller city or a big city. But as we look at San Antonio or Greenville or Charlottesville, where we've looked at similar models, having a thing that we've done that is more similar than different and turning it into a routine is extremely helpful. So that would be my take. But I guess, you have been, we've both been all across the country. You have been in New York and San Francisco, but you've also been in Waterloo, Iowa, and Charlottesville, Virginia, and smaller cities. What is especially important for smaller cities to learn from what you've seen?
So I would say the poster child for opportunity zones is Erie, Pennsylvania, which is 100,000 people in a metropolitan area that's probably 350,000, right? So I think what we've learned in Erie, Pennsylvania are several things. Erie, Pennsylvania is a place that has been hard hit for decades by deindustrialization. But it still has the Lake Erie, beautiful. And it has a downtown, sort of a post-Civil War downtown that was bordered by 3 anchor institutions: a big healthcare complex, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Gannon University, and Erie Insurance Company. And really what happened with opportunity zones is it enabled Erie Insurance to think really about what you've written about, Ross, which is one pocket investment. They had always been very philanthropic in the community. It's the biggest employer in Erie, but they began to think about investing in the downtown around the major square, Perry Square, and take a group of buildings, attached buildings, and bring them back in part as a food experience, but also residential, office, et cetera. And they made a substantial investment in opportunity zones to make that deal, hard deal in a place like Erie, happen. And I think, so opportunity zones for smaller cities in particular, where literally the private sector, community foundation, the public sector, the universities, you can get everyone into one room. And you basically can all look at each other and say, no one is going to save us. I mean, the federal government, far away, completely dysfunctional. The state governments, for the most part, are not really clued in to how to do these kinds of really tough transactions in particularly weak markets. So you can look around the room and say, okay, how do we begin to unlock our capital? Some of it should be philanthropic, some of it should be patient, and some of it should be focused on market returns. And that's what Erie has done. And I think the Erie model and the combination of how they thought about different kinds of intermediaries, they created an Erie Downtown Development Corporation based on the Center City Development Corporation in Cincinnati. They thought just very clearly about how to bring life and vibrancy and vitality to a downtown that literally had not seen positive movement in decades. That's what Opportunity Zones basically galvanize in Erie, and it can do it all over the country.
So I'm conscious that we're two white guys talking about investment in neighborhoods, many of which are majority people of color. And there are a lot of voices that are really important in this conversation who are not in this current conversation, but should be in these rooms and are often excluded. Danielle has a great question that says, there are numerous entrepreneurs of color coming together to rebuild community wealth in response to systemic practices to keep the community disenfranchised. See Black Wall Street and so forth. How do you challenge this in your work versus solely talking about investment?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is enable those entrepreneurs to realize their individual aspirations, but then to come together really as a collective and make some transformative change in their neighborhoods. I mean, I'm working right now in St. Louis. St. Louis, essentially like Detroit, saw radical depopulation, out-migration. I mean, literally, it wasn't just white flight, it was company flight outside the city. The city's about 300,000. North of the Delmar Divide, like many cities, there's this hard racial divide. There was literally no investment for decades. And, you know, most cities have built up a very rich ecosystem around growing tech companies, right, with venture capital. No ecosystem around growing businesses owned by people of color, none whatsoever. The services, the mentoring, the sort of equity kind of investment, the customers coming from universities or hospitals. So I think what we're trying to do is provide a platform for these entrepreneurs to succeed, because the current system basically is not organized for success at all. I mean, at all. And we're trying to basically build that kind of structure. So it's not just investment. It's really the whole piece. Where are your customers coming from? What are the services you need to navigate this new market? What's capital that's fit to purpose, right? Debt capital, for the most part, is not fit to purpose for many of these companies. And then what are other interventions that could have some synergistic effect in those neighborhoods as well? The last piece I'll just say, what's your ownership plan? Who owns the real estate? Who captures value if value appreciates? I mean, that's fundamental to this. So I think what we've been trying to just really focus on is a platform success. So it's not just about capital, though we talk about capital a lot. It's really about this whole interconnected, you know, demand, supply.
A lot of times the ideas that might help make a change come from people who aren't typically in the room. So for example, right. I was involved in a project with the Kauffman Foundation called the Capital Access Lab to finance new models of investment. And one of the investments out of that project is a fund called CoLab out of Atlanta, founded by a woman named Jewel Solomon, entrepreneur. She raised more money than any other Black woman in venture capital history. It was in the single-digit millions, so great for Jewel. Also shows huge inequities in access to capital. Sold her company to Amazon, did very well. Wanted to reinvest in Black entrepreneurs in Atlanta and realized that many of the businesses that she wanted to finance were not a fit for traditional venture capital. So she started a profit-sharing model for her fund, CoLab. She joined forces with two other Black entrepreneurs, and they make seed investments in companies and share in the profits. And I was explaining when Jewel was trying to raise money, I was explaining to an institutional investor how their model worked and how it's different from a venture fund. And the institutional investor didn't get it all. And I went back to Jewel and they said something like, does this model have a track record? And Jewel said something like, that person's obviously never been to a Black church. This is just, you know, pass the hat, start a business, everyone shares in the profits. It's a very well-trodden path in you know, where I come from. And so there are some of these models are existing, just haven't been routinized or institutionalized. So we're talking about investment. Danielle makes the great follow-up point. Investment is great. Policy change is imperative. What policies do you think need to change? What policy change would you prescribe?
Well, Gavin raises a great point that large public universities are bound by state-approved purchasing contracts. So they tend to go for lowest price. They don't particularly care whether they're purchasing local. Hospitals in the United States, many are part of group purchasing agreements, right? So it's not even the hospital that's basically making many of the decisions. They're delegating it to some group purchasing organization, which is then probably buying their food services from large companies like Aramark, right? So it's not just public policy that has to change. It's institutional practice that has to change. I mean, we're talking about decades of very large employers in US cities operating a certain way. So investors in many American cities delegated their investment decisions to asset managers that then sent all their capital to the coast, right? And then major employers delegated their purchasing decisions to some group purchasing organizations that also did not buy local. So policy change is critical, public policy change, but this is institutional change. It's deeply embedded that the US has done so many things that operate against community wealth. And the more you sort of peel back the onion, the more you realize how much structural change, paradigmatic change, but just basic practice has to change. I think that's what's beginning, right? I mean, you got to start somewhere, and it's starting local. I'm in Philadelphia, where Drexel's located. There's the Philadelphia Anchors for Growth and Equity. In Chicago's, there's the Chicago Anchors for a Strong Economy. They're coming together as consortia. They're first learning how they practice today, and then they're beginning to basically change fundamentally how they do their business. Yeah, but it's decades of operating a particular way that have to be basically reversed.
Thanks. So Mary from Abingdon and Miles from Charlottesville are asking questions that I think are really getting at something similar. Mary asks, any insights into how to convert what might be a growing dependence upon taxpayer money to an investment mindset, meaning using taxpayer money to launch entrepreneurs who are then able to participate in an economy. In many of the nation's rural areas, grants are becoming a way of economic life instead of an engine to nudge the private sector. And Miles says, I hear a lot of talk about investment opportunities. What are the parallel investments that need to happen to prepare the impacted community for economic growth opportunity? I think you talk a lot about both of these questions in the transition from community development, which is top-down, grants and programs come into your community, and that's that, to community wealth, which is bottom up. How do we generate indigenous growth in communities? So whether it's Abingdon, Virginia, in Southwest Virginia, or one of the other places you work across the country, how do you answer these questions?
Well, I think it's grants and public incentives more broadly. So I would say the public sector is an investor in many projects specifically, and more broadly, or potential investor in community wealth building. So I think it's really how people start with what your end game is. What is the end game, right? The end game is you want to build community wealth. You want to raise incomes. You want to raise assets. And you want to counter what is the driving economic force in our country today, which is consolidation. And really, to tell you the truth, the triumph of the large over the small. Amazon on the e-commerce side, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, the dollar stores, big box retail, right? So how do you counter that? You can't be Pollyannish about it, because those forces are very, very large. I think you have to counter it by having a different philosophy about where demand for business, goods and services are coming from. And then grants or other public resources can be part of the capital to do what it is you want to accomplish. It could be mixed income housing. It could be redevelopment of a downtown. It could be investment in entrepreneurs. So I think I start with a sort of end game and backcast, and public resources, whether they're tax incentives, whether they're grants, whether they're competitive, whether they're block granted, whether they're financial products out of SBA, they're part of the package. They're not the package. They're a means to an end. And I would say, particularly as we move past this election, I think there's going to be enormous burden really on cities, whether they're small, mid-tier, or large, to organize themselves so that they could leverage up all these different sources of capital towards one purpose, which is really community wealth building. And I understand the question. I think grants are essential, just given the fact that so much of our economic growth in the United States has been concentrated in a relatively small number of metropolitan areas. I mean, that's just what has happened in the past 25 years. So public resources I think are critical as part of the diversifying of the economy, and having, a sort of a broader group of places and people participate fully in economic prosperity.
So David's got a question, and we're gonna wind down probably in the next 10 minutes or so, and I'm gonna hit on a few of the big national hot topics. David asks about automation, and I think the effects of automation and technology on rural areas and sectors in a negative sense is pretty well documented. Are there ways that cities can apply the benefits of efficiency of automation and other technologies to building community wealth?
Well, I don't think automation applies uniformly across the board. So it definitely applies in certain sectors of the economy, has already played out in certain sectors of the economy. And frankly, many parts of the world are more automated than we are. Very mature economies are more automated than we are. I think the response to this has got to happen on the skills side. When I'm in cities right now, what I see from major employers, mid-tier employers, or even small businesses is an absolute excruciating demand for workers with technology skills. That is not what is being taught in many high schools, community colleges, or workforce development programs. I would say go take a look at what Rhode Island has done over Gina Raimondo's leadership over the past 5 years. It has been a fundamental shift in the kind of credentialing in skills training that is coming out of their high schools, community colleges, 4-year, and others. And so I think the counter to automation is to basically radically change how we think about education and skills training in the United States, and have it be just fundamentally, business cluster led, aligned with what a particular place is good at. I think this is a system that is in dire need of change and upheaval. And by the way, someone asked a question about auto mechanics. Go to St. Louis. Rankin Technology College has existed since 1907, right? They are so good at providing these kinds of skilled technicians, electricians, welders, auto mechanics. You get what you pay for. You get what you invest in. We haven't invested in this in the United States. We have to do it. And this is really a local driven phenomenon, not just waiting for the perfect federal program.
So we're running short on time. I'm gonna I went to the University of Virginia undergrad. My undergraduate advisor was all right, we have one more question actually popping up. And then we'll go. So we have 2 more questions. Second to last question from Scott. I don't get the fixation with buy local. Products originate from given areas due to their comparative advantage. Buy local subverts this, creating inefficiency. Example, why should U.S. transit agencies buy domestic rail equipment when Asian countries sell it for cheaper?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. What I'm focusing on with buy local is just think about what your hospital or what your university, I mean, think about the employers that are ubiquitous across the United States, financial institutions, utilities, et cetera. Think about what they buy, right? And that could cross a continuum of goods and services, right? What do they buy around construction as they're building their campus? Who designs their campuses? Who does the facility management? The construction trades. I mean, let's begin to break down what our major employers purchase on a regular basis and from whom they purchase. So I think the manufacturing side on the transit piece is a little bit different than what I'm describing, which is more of the uniform way in which cities and metropolitan areas look in the US and how they operate. And from my perspective today, with a very few exceptions, there's an enormous amount of leakage of where products are purchased, and there's no focus really on growing community wealth at all. And I think just a cursory examination of your major employers in any given place would basically show that that is true.
So last question, and there's probably an hour-long answer to this question and a 2-minute answer, and I'll ask you to do the 2-minute version. Larry Sabato, the political pundit, was my undergrad advisor at the University of Virginia, and I'm going to ask you to play a little bit of a Larry Sabato, but policy and not necessarily election results. What do you think happens after next Tuesday on the topic of community wealth in the U.S.?
Well, I think it completely depends on what happens with the election. If Biden is elected,
I'm asking you to make an election prediction too.
No, but if Biden is elected and the Democrats win the Senate, we're going to have a significant stimulus package, which the country absolutely desperately needs. Unemployment insurance, small business relief, and counter-cyclical investments in innovation, infrastructure, human capital. We absolutely need this, or else this is going to be a painful decade. We learned a lot in 2008 and 2009. So it really depends upon that fact, because essentially the Republican Senate was not even willing to agree. They were willing to, appoint a new Supreme Court justice, but they did not provide the kind of relief for unemployed workers and small businesses. So I think community wealth, at the end of the day, requires first and foremost cities, towns, metropolitan areas, suburbs, counties, having a different way of doing business. Federal resources, if they come, that then can be deployed effectively and efficiently. But federal resources by themselves are not sufficient, but they are critical. But I would say for everyone listening to this, it's time to get organized locally, have a clear vision of what community wealth means in your community, the strategies to get there, and then you can put federal resources to task. We'll see in 6 days what happens.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone for chipping in and making this a really fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. I would love to give Bruce a big virtual round of applause and turn it over to Ben for some closing thoughts from TomTom. Thanks, everybody.
Sure thing. And thanks, Ross. Thanks, Bruce, so much for being here. This was an incredible conversation, and we're just really grateful for your time and for your expertise. This event is part of a final week of programs at the Cities Rising Summit. It's been brought to you by Apex Clean Energy, who we appreciate for their support and collaboration throughout the summit in the past year. Speaking of community wealth building, we do have a panel this afternoon around possible implementation of basic income policy with the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, and Jenna Roscoe from Operation Hope. So we hope you'll join us for that. And tomorrow we wrap things up. We'll be talking about clean energy infrastructure and sustainability with a state senator, Jennifer McClellan from Virginia here. So just wanted to give you that briefing and just welcome you to become a contributing member to the foundation. If you found these programs compelling or interesting, you can do so on our website, tomtomfoundation.org. Thank you again. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Ross, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.